Hey guys, how's it going? Mega Gears here. So I decided to go ahead and give some thoughts and even pose some questions to you as the audience. Have comics become too niche for its own good? A lot of times we look at comic books back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s. They've dipped, they've waxed and waned, but overall they tend to be pretty successful as a medium. You look at comics back in the 40s and 50s where they sold billions of copies. You have X-Men comics in the early 90s with Jim Lee that sold 8 million copies. And you start to wonder, what exactly went wrong? Why are comic book sales so low? Why does it seem the industry in itself seems to be struggling compared to video games and movies and television? And it seems to me personally that it's become just something too niche. They strive over a market for a reach a demographic or a market that necessarily isn't as big as they think. Don't necessarily seem to be really paying or spending enough money or supporting these books that are supposedly big sellers. It seems that comics have focused too much on superheroes, and I personally enjoy superhero comics, but I also like other different stories. I enjoy sci-fi fantasy books. I enjoy noir detective thrillers, but there doesn't seem to be a publisher putting it out. That's really huge. There are publishers that are doing it, independent publishers, but here comes in the question of accessibility. Word of mouth comes in because unless you're really hungry and searching for these books, there doesn't seem to be a large group of advertisement or comic book shops to be pushing these titles. And it's kind of sad to say that because it seems that comics aren't really respected as a medium in the casual audience. You bring up comic books and people will look at you and it's like, oh, that's for kids, or they automatically think, oh yeah, superhero comics. Yeah, that's not for me. What brings to my mind is a article written by Chuck Dixon. It came out a couple years ago. It's called Comics for Dummies, and he has a lot of really good points of how comics back in the 30s to 60s was for the mainstream entertainment, was for the casual audience. You had titles from Batman to Donald Duck to young romance to pulp sci-fi stories. He mentions that if these comics dip below million sales, 1 million sales, could you imagine comics selling a million, million Spider-Man comics, a million Superman comics? That would be crazy, but awesome. But back then, if they dip below a million sales, they would be canceled. Now imagine that, comics that are around the 15,000 mark or the 10,000 mark, and they're still going on. Those books aren't canceled, unfortunately. And you start to look at how, even though they would dip and wax and wane in the 60s, they would still go on really strong. You got so many different spin-off titles, from Dennis the Menace to Melvin the Monster, to Pat the Brat, to Dexter the Demon. All these different spin-off rip-offs of the same character. You got G.I. Joe books, the Howling Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos. Heavy emphasis was put on superhero books, especially with the Batman TV show coming out in the 60s. But here lies in the situation is that you got a lot of superhero comics. The big two reign supreme. You don't get too many publicized Western books or horror books or anything else to satisfy the medium. Now, when I say that, I don't mean they don't exist. I don't mean that publishers aren't putting them out, but they're independent publishers. And it seems like Diamond really doesn't care. They monopolize the market with local comic book shops. And also at the same time, local comic book shops aren't willing to take the risk. Some are, but they're afraid to get burned. So what do these independent comic book publishers do? They use Twitter. They try to use word of mouth. They go and find the people that want these books. Unfortunately, advertisement for comic books aren't really there. DC tends to do a little bit better about that, and you can see that they're trying. But comics should be for everyone. You hear that argument how comics should be for everyone, but you don't necessarily see that. You see comics like X-Men get pushed to the side. You see other comics that change to something that the hardcore fan base or the fans that have been there for a while don't necessarily want. It seems like it's more of a complex issue. Yes, agendas play into it. Yes, politics play into it. But I feel, honestly, that some people just don't know what the consumer wants. Some of them just have been in the comic book industry so long that they just don't care. Or others have gotten so fed up for writing for the big two, knowing that these big ideas that they've come up with, these characters that they've spent years developing, will never be theirs. So they leave these big publishers and join Image Comics to write their love projects, the projects that they've been wanting to tell, like Jonathan Hickman and Jeff Lemire. A lot of these other guys have just left to do their own thing and hopefully rely on their name of being the Ed Brubaker, the Greg Pak, to be able to sell these stories on word of mouth in their name. So many people have found out about books just because of talking to other people in the comic book community. I know me as myself, I would have never found out about any of these books if it wasn't for social media. Social media has been the key to help books be more successful. They have been the key to get a smaller artist or amateur artist or indie artist out there that are very talented but can't get their name out there through any other type of way. Comics should be for everybody, like stated before. Some people want sci-fi books. Some people want slice of life. I think what the problem is that people take the superhero genre and throw slice of life into it, disregarding the people that joined reading Superman or The Flash or Spider-Man or X-Men for superhero stories, for action-packed stories. You can't discount a certain group of people to please another group. If you sacrifice one group of people for another, it just doesn't work. It's not solid business practice, in my opinion. You should have these superhero books and leave them as superhero books. Have stories where there is no no gray line. Superheroes shouldn't be the anti-heroes. Then you should have stories where you have characters that are anti-heroes. You should have comics that are private mysteries, PI, noir stories. You should have slice of life stories. You should have coming of age stories. All these should be for everyone, well written, well told, and be able to be advertised and put out there. But here comes the question. Because it's about money, no one wants to take the risk. So is it up to us as the consumer to be able to look out these things and support them and be able to advertise the books through social media, being able to share them? Or is it just for the artists and creators themselves to say, you know what, we're not going to rely on a distributor for local comic book stores. We're going to go to Books A Million, Barnes and Noble, other book shops, other book stores, other book chains to be able to put our books out there, because the comic book shops aren't willing to do it. We'll go digitally and put these books on Comixology and say, hey guys, guess what? We've got this book out here. Should stories be more focused on being individual graphic novels, original graphic novels, instead of relying on an ongoing series, which may or may not come depending on how the story sells? Is it just